There is something quietly extraordinary about the moment just before sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the immediate world and begins to drift towards something older, something deeper, something that feels in a way you cannot entirely explain, like memory. Not your memory, exactly. Something larger, something inherited. Tonight, as you settle into the particular warmth of your bed and let the weight of the day finally release from your shoulders, you're going to travel somewhere that no airplane ticket can take you. You're going to move through time itself, not in the frantic way of dreams, but gently, the way a river moves through ancient stone, wearing it smooth over centuries without ever seeming to hurry. The civilizations you're about to visit are not the ones that fill the popular imagination. You will not be spending much time in Rome or Athens tonight, though those are fine places in their own right. No, the places you are going are stranger than that, older than that, and in many ways far more mysterious. These are the cultures that rose and flourished, and left behind only fragments, only whispers, only stones arranged in ways that still make archaeologists argue passionately at conferences held in hotels with very bad coffee. These are the civilizations that vanished so completely that we are not even entirely sure what to call them, let alone what they believed or why they disappeared. And yet they were here. They were absolutely, undeniably, magnificently here. They built things that still stand. They left marks on the landscape that can be seen from above. They moved stones that weigh as much as 400 metric tons. They recorded things we cannot yet read. And then, for reasons that the earth has not yet fully chosen to share with us, they were gone. Let us begin, as all good journeys must, not at the destination, but somewhere along the way, in the middle of the ocean, roughly halfway between the coasts of Portugal and North America, where a group of islands rises from the Atlantic, like the scattered remnants of something much larger. The Azores have fascinated historians and dreamers for centuries, partly because of their dramatic volcanic beauty, and partly because of a story that refuses to stay quietly in the past. The story of Atlantis is so famous now that it has become almost impossible to approach without preconceptions. Most people either believe in it with a fervor that borders on religion or dismiss it with a weariness that suggests they have had this argument one too many times at family dinners. But tonight, as the softness of your pillow becomes more pronounced and the world outside your window grows quieter, consider approaching Atlantis the way you might approach a dream you half remember, not asking whether it is literally true, but wondering what truth it might be reaching toward. Plato first described Atlantis in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written sometime around 360 BC. He described it as a naval power that had existed 9,000 years before his own time, a calculation that places it at roughly 9600 BC, deep in what geologists call the early Holocene period, just after the last great glacial retreat. Plato's Atlantis was a sophisticated maritime civilization organized in concentric rings of land and water, with an elaborate infrastructure of canals and harbors, with a social hierarchy, with metallurgy, with agriculture, with temples. He described it as sitting beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is to say beyond the Strait of Gibraltar in the open Atlantic. And then he described it sinking beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophic flooding. Most classical scholars believe Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical device, a way of exploring his ideas about hubris and the corruption of power. This is a perfectly reasonable interpretation, and is probably the correct one in its narrow literal sense. But here is the thing that keeps the story interesting. The thing that prevents it from simply being filed away under mythology and left alone. The period Plato identified for Atlantis' destruction corresponds with extraordinary precision to one of the most dramatic environmental events in human prehistory. around 9,600 BC, as the last great ice age reached its conclusion, sea levels around the world rose by an estimated 120 meters. This was not a sudden event in human terms. It happened over thousands of years, but on a geological timescale, it was remarkably rapid. Coastlines that had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years disappeared beneath the water. Lowland river valleys became estuaries, and then bays, and then open ocean. Vast stretches of continental shelf that had supported human populations became the seafloor. We know now that the coastlines of 12,000 years ago looked radically different from those of today. The island of Britain was connected to continental Europe by a broad, fertile plain that geologists have named Doggerland, a landmass roughly the size of present-day Germany, which was home to hunter-gatherer communities for thousands of years before the rising seas finally swallowed it, sometime around 6,500 BC. In the Persian Gulf, what is now open water was once a river valley of extraordinary richness, fed by the combined flows of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In Southeast Asia, an entire subcontinent that researchers have named Sundaland occupied much of what is now the South China Sea, connecting the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java to the Asian mainland. These places were real. They were inhabited, and they are now, every one of them, beneath the sea. So perhaps the story of Atlantis is not so much the story of one specific civilization, as it is the accumulated mythologized memory of a world that was genuinely lost. Oral traditions are extraordinarily persistent. Studies of Indigenous Australian cultures have documented oral histories that accurately describe geographical features that were altered by sea level rise more than 10,000 years ago. The human instinct to remember, to pass stories forward, to warn the future about what the past experienced, is powerful enough to preserve information across hundreds of generations. If dozens of coastal communities around the Atlantic Basin were displaced by rising seas during the early Holocene, it would be remarkable if that collective trauma had not, over the millennia, crystallized into a story about a great civilization swallowed by the ocean. This is the kind of thinking that will carry you through the night, soft and speculative and endlessly interesting. The kind of thinking that does not demand conclusions, but simply wonders, openly and without agenda. Settle a little deeper into your blankets now, and let us move from the Atlantic and its mysteries to somewhere drier and considerably older. The Sahara Desert covers roughly 9 million square kilometers of northern Africa, making it the largest hot desert on Earth. It is a landscape of extraordinary austere beauty, all golden dunes and eroded sandstone plateaus, and sky of an impossible blue. It is also, in its current form, only about 5,000 years old. Before approximately 3000 BC, the Sahara was something almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. During what scientists call the African Humid Period, or more colloquially the Green Sahara, the entire region experienced a dramatically different climate. Rivers flowed where there is now only cracked clay. Lakes dotted the landscape from Mauritania to Chad. Forests of acacia and wild olive grew where sand now drifts in silence, and people lived there in considerable numbers, herding cattle and fishing the lakes and painting images of extraordinary vividness on rock faces throughout the region. The rock art of the Sahara is one of the most remarkable and least discussed artistic archives on Earth. In the Tassili Najjer Plateau of southern Algeria, in the Fezzan region of Libya, in the Air Mountains of Niger, there are tens of thousands of images painted and carved into stone over a period spanning perhaps 12,000 years. The earliest images, dating to the period of the Green Sahara, show animals that the modern Sahara could not possibly support. Hippopotamuses wallowing in rivers, crocodiles, elephants, giraffes, and cattle in vast herds. They show human figures engaged in activities that speak of settled, complex communities, ceremonial dances, what appear to be ritual processions, figures wearing elaborate headdresses and robes. Later, images show the cattle giving way to horses, and the horses giving way to camels, a sequence that precisely tracks the drying of the climate over thousands of years. But among the more conventional images, there are others that have sparked arguments which show no signs of resolving themselves. The so-called round-head figures of the Tassili Nadjer are among the strangest things painted by human hands anywhere on the planet. These figures, which date to somewhere between 8,000 and 6,000 BC, depict humanoid forms with enormous, featureless, rounded heads, sometimes surrounded by a kind of halo or helmet, with bodies that seem to float rather than stand. They are unlike anything else in the Saharan rock art tradition. Some researchers have suggested they depict shamanic visions, figures seen during altered states of consciousness. Others have proposed they represent masked ritual figures. A small and enthusiastic fringe has suggested they look rather like astronauts, a theory that tends to generate more heat than light in academic circles. What they most likely represent, stripped of both the mundane and the sensational interpretations, is evidence of a spiritual and symbolic life of considerable sophistication among people who lived in a green, productive landscape that has since been erased so completely that we struggle even to imagine it. When the rains stopped, as they did with gradual but relentless certainty between about 5,000 and 3,000 BC, the people of the Green Sahara had to go somewhere. Many researchers believe they went east, following the remaining rivers, settling in the Nile Valley in increasing numbers. If this is true, and the archaeological evidence increasingly supports it, then Egyptian civilization was not an isolated flowering of human genius, but in part the concentration of cultural, spiritual, and practical knowledge accumulated over thousands of years by a much larger and more widespread population across a now vanished landscape. The cattle herders of the Green Sahara became, in this reading, the ancestors of pharaonic Egypt, carrying with them their cattle cults and their astronomical knowledge, and their complex relationship with the sacred, transplanting it to the fertile strip of the Nile, and building from it one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. This is not a diminishment of Egypt's achievement. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. The idea that a civilization grew from a displaced people who had learned to thrive in a world that no longer existed, who carried their knowledge forward through the disaster of desertification and planted it in new soil. There is something almost unbearably human about that, something that resonates tonight as you breathe slowly and let the imagery wash over you. The green land turning gold, the lakes drying to white salt flats, the herds of cattle thinning as the grass retreats, and the people moving east, carrying their stories with them, carrying their paintings and their songs and their understanding of the stars. Let us follow the stars for a moment, because they lead somewhere interesting. One of the most persistent and productive areas of research in the study of forgotten civilizations involves what is sometimes called archaeastronomy, the study of how ancient peoples understood, recorded, and structured their lives around the movements of celestial bodies. It is well established that many ancient cultures had sophisticated astronomical knowledge, that Stonehenge is aligned with the midsummer sunrise, that the great temples of ancient Egypt track specific stellar risings, that the Maya calendar, which we will visit shortly, was one of the most precise timekeeping systems ever developed by a pre-industrial culture. But the depth and antiquity of human astronomical knowledge goes considerably beyond what is commonly appreciated. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, on a ridge overlooking the Heron Plain, there is an archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe that has, since its excavation began in the 1990s, steadily demolished a great many assumptions about the timeline of human civilization. Before Göbekli Tepe, the standard narrative of prehistory ran roughly as follows. Human beings were hunters and gatherers for most of their existence, living in relatively small mobile groups. Around 10,000 BC, in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, they began to domesticate plants and animals, which allowed them to settle in permanent communities. Those permanent communities gradually became villages, and villages gradually became towns, and towns gradually accumulated the economic surplus and social complexity necessary to support specialists, which is to say, people who did not have to grow their own food, who could instead devote their time to pottery or metallurgy or administration or the construction of monumental architecture. In short, settlement came first and monuments came later. Göbekli Tepe turned this narrative upside down, shook it, and set it back on its feet facing in a completely different direction. The site consists of at least 20 circular enclosures, each formed by a ring of T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them reaching 6 meters in height and weighing up to 20 metric tons, decorated with elaborate carvings of animals, insects, birds, and abstract symbols. The site dates to approximately 11,600 BC, making it more than 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and more than 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. It was built, as far as the evidence can tell, by people who had not yet developed agriculture, by hunter-gatherers who nonetheless organized themselves to quarry, transport, carve, and erect enormous stone pillars in arrangements of evident symbolic significance. This is extraordinary for several reasons. First, it means that the human capacity for complex symbolic thought, for communal spiritual practice, for the kind of social organization required to build monumental structures, preceded the development of agriculture rather than following from it. Second, it suggests that the great leap forward in human cultural complexity may have been driven not by economic factors, not by the accumulation of agricultural surplus, but by something more difficult to quantify, perhaps by a religious or symbolic imperative, a felt need to create sacred spaces, to mark the earth with meaning. Third, and most intriguingly for our purposes tonight, it raises the question of what else may have existed at this early period that has simply not survived. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Around 8,000 BC, the site's builders filled the enclosures with rubble and earth in what appears to have been an intentional act of ritual closure. This is why it survived so remarkably well. But how many other sites of similar antiquity and significance were simply abandoned rather than buried, left to the slow erosion of wind and rain over 13,000 years? How many sites lie not on dry hilltops, but on coastlines that were inundated by rising seas? The honest answer is that we do not know, that we cannot know, that the map of human prehistory has gaps in it large enough to swallow entire civilizations, and that the absence of evidence is very far from being evidence of absence. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who directed the excavations at Göbekli Tepe from their beginning until his death in 2014, believed that the site was a pilgrimage destination, a sacred center that drew people from across a wide region. He noted that the nearest source of water was several kilometers away, that the hilltop location had no obvious practical advantage, that everything about the site pointed towards ceremony rather than habitation. If he was right, then Göbekli Tepe is evidence not merely of a community with sophisticated symbolic culture, but of a network of communities connected by shared religious practice, something that looks, in its broad outlines, rather like civilization, even if it predates what we formally recognize as civilization by thousands of years. The carvings on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe have been analyzed exhaustively, and one recent and contested study published in 2017 proposed that specific arrangements of animal symbols on the pillars correspond to astronomical events, specifically to the positions of constellations, and to the impact of a comet around 10,850 BC, an event that corresponds to a dramatic, sudden cooling of the global climate known as the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was one of the most abrupt climate events of the last 20,000 years, a plunge in temperatures across the northern hemisphere that lasted roughly 1,200 years and dramatically disrupted the emerging post-glacial ecosystems. If the Göbekli Tepe carvings do record this event, it would suggest that the site's builders were not merely creating sacred spaces, but documenting their experience of a global catastrophe, encoding the memory of disaster in stone, so that it would not be forgotten. You have probably been settling more deeply into your pillow for the past few minutes, and your breathing has likely grown slower and more even. This is good. This is exactly right. There is no hurry here. The civilizations we are visiting have been waiting patiently for a very long time, and they will wait a little longer. Let the weight of your body soften into the mattress. Let your thoughts become less sharp-edged. We are moving now from Turkey south and east, back into deep time, toward a civilization so old and so strange and so thoroughly forgotten that it did not even have a name until archaeologists gave it one in the 20th century. In the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, between roughly 2600 and 1900 BC, there flourished a civilization that was, by most measures of the term, one of the most sophisticated urban cultures of the ancient world. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after one of its major cities, occupied an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. At its height, it may have supported a population of between 5 million and 10 million people, distributed across hundreds of settlements, ranging from small villages to large, carefully planned cities. The two largest known cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, had populations estimated at between 40,000 and 80,000 people each, making them comparable in size to ancient Ur or to the later Greek city-states. What makes the Indus Valley Civilization particularly remarkable and particularly mysterious is its extraordinary consistency. Across an area spanning more than 1 million square kilometers, across hundreds of separate settlements, the cities and towns of the Harappan culture were built to remarkably uniform standards. Streets were laid out on a grid. Buildings were constructed from standardized fired bricks of consistent proportions. Systems of weights and measures were standardized across the entire civilization, and the evidence suggests that all of this was accomplished without the monumental architecture typically associated with early states. There are no pyramids in the Indus Valley. There are no great temples visible from miles away. There are no elaborate royal tombs packed with golden treasures. Whatever held this civilization together, whatever organized and coordinated it across such an enormous area, it was not the ostentatious display of power that characterized Egypt or Mesopotamia. Mohenjo-daro, which means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, is the best preserved of the major Harappan cities. It had a population of somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people, streets wide enough for ox carts to pass each other comfortably, a sophisticated sewage and drainage system more advanced than anything that would appear in Europe for another 3,000 years, and public buildings including a large bath that may have served ritual purification purposes. It had no obvious palace, no obviously royal quarter, no monuments to specific rulers. The standardization of weights and measures implies some form of central authority, some governing body capable of enforcing consistent standards across a vast territory. But that authority left behind none of the self-glorifying inscriptions or monumental art that rulers in other early civilizations seem to have considered essential. The Indus script, the writing system used by Harappan civilization, has not been deciphered. Despite a century of attempts, despite the availability of thousands of inscribed objects, Despite the application of every computational tool modern linguistics can bring to bear, the script remains unreadable. It is not for lack of trying. Some of the greatest minds in linguistics and cryptography have spent significant portions of their careers on this problem. The script has no Rosetta Stone equivalent, no bilingual inscription that might provide a key, and the signs are often found in very short sequences on stamp seals, which limits the amount of statistical analysis that can be applied. This is not merely frustrating from an academic standpoint. It means that the Harappans cannot speak to us. They left behind a civilization of extraordinary accomplishment, and we cannot hear a single word they said. Around 1900 BC, the Indus Valley civilization began to decline. The great cities were gradually abandoned. The sophisticated urban infrastructure fell into disrepair. The population dispersed eastward toward the Ganges plain. The reasons for this collapse are, like so much about Harappan civilization, still debated. Climate change, specifically a long-term aridification of the region, appears to have played a significant role. The monsoon patterns shifted. The rivers that had sustained the civilization changed course or dried. Agricultural yields fell, but the collapse was gradual rather than sudden, spread over several centuries, and the Harappan population did not disappear, but rather transformed, dispersing and blending with other populations to form the foundation of later South Asian cultures. The knowledge they carried, the techniques, the spiritual practices, the symbolic repertoire, did not vanish, but was absorbed and transformed, contributing in ways we are only beginning to understand to the later cultural flowering that produced the Vedic tradition, and, ultimately, the rich complexity of classical Indian civilization. This is one of the most important and most often overlooked patterns in the history of civilizations. They do not simply vanish. Even the most catastrophic collapses leave survivors who carry something forward. The people do not disappear when the cities fall. They walk away and they carry their knowledge and their stories and their habits with them, and they teach their children, and their children teach their grandchildren, and somewhere in the web of transmission, something of what was is preserved, changed but alive, waiting to be recognized. This recognition sometimes happens in the most unexpected ways. In the highlands of Mexico, in the mountains west of the Valley of Mexico, there is a site called Teodanango, whose name means Place of the Divine Wall in Nahuatl. It was occupied by the Matlatzinca people before the Aztec expansion of the 15th century, and it contains, among its ruins, structures that clearly draw on much older architectural traditions, going back through the Toltec period and deeper still. The Aztecs, when they encountered such older sites, often treated them as sacred, as the dwelling places of gods, or the works of a previous greater humanity. They called the builders of Teotihuacan the enormous city in the Valley of Mexico that had been abandoned 600 years before the Aztecs rose to prominence, the Toltecs, a name that functioned less as an ethnic identifier than as a generic term, meaning master builders or people of civilization. The Aztecs knew they were inheritors, not originators. They felt the weight of the past pressing on them, and they found it not burdensome, but sacred. Let us spend a little time in Teotihuacan, because it is one of the most remarkable forgotten civilizations on Earth, and one of the most underappreciated by the general public, which tends to reserve its enthusiasm for the Aztecs and the Maya while treating the culture that built Teotihuacan as a kind of unnamed prologue. Teotihuacan was, at its height sometime around 400 AD, one of the largest cities in the world. It covered an area of roughly 83 square kilometers and had a population estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000 people, making it larger than Rome at the same period. It was laid out along a massive central avenue, now called the Avenue of the Dead, lined with temple platforms and administrative buildings, at the northern end of which stood the Pyramid of the Moon, and, further south, dominating the entire cityscape, the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the largest structures ever built in the ancient world. The base of the Pyramid of the Sun measures approximately 220 meters on each side, and it rises to a height of 65 meters, containing an estimated 1 million cubic meters of fill material. It was built without the wheel, without metal tools, without draft animals, by a culture whose name we do not know, because Teotihuacan left no readable inscriptions, no royal histories, no identified rulers. This is perhaps the most disorienting thing about Teotihuacan. For all its scale, for all the evidence of its power and sophistication, it is deeply anonymous. The Aztecs named its monuments. The original names are unknown. The Aztecs saw its ruins and concluded that the gods had built it. The actual builders left no account of themselves. The city flourished for roughly 600 years, from about 100 BC to 550 AD, and during that time it was a center of enormous cultural and commercial influence. Its distinctive artistic style and its distinctive green obsidian traceable in cultures across Mesoamerica. And then it burned. Around 550 AD, the civic and ceremonial core of the city was deliberately set on fire. The burning appears to have been targeted, focused on public buildings and elite residences, not on the residential compounds where ordinary people lived. This has led many researchers to conclude that the burning was not an external conquest, but an internal revolt, a rising of the city's population against its ruling class, a destruction not of the city, but of its governing structure. If this interpretation is correct, and the archaeological evidence supports it reasonably well, then the fall of Teotihuacan was not a simple collapse, but a kind of revolution, one whose full story we cannot read because the people who lived it did not leave us their account. The population did not immediately disperse. The city continued to be inhabited for some time afterward, though at a much reduced scale and without its former organizational complexity. Eventually it was largely abandoned, and when the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico centuries later, they found its ruins already ancient, already mythologized, already a holy place. You are probably quite relaxed now, and the imagery of pyramids and ancient cities has perhaps softened at the edges, the way all imagery softens as sleep approaches, becoming more atmospheric than precise. This is a fine state to be in. The stories do not require precision to be received. They only require openness, a willingness to let the past be present for a moment, to feel the extraordinary length and depth of human time reaching back behind you into the darkness, full of people who were as real as you are, as hopeful, as inventive, as afraid, as alive. We have been moving through the Americas and the Middle East and Africa, and we have not yet visited the part of the world that contains perhaps the greatest concentration of forgotten civilizations, the part of the world where the oceans themselves have conspired with time to erase entire chapters of human history. Let us go east now to the islands and shores of the Pacific, where the deepest mysteries of human migration and cultural achievement still wait to be fully understood. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. It is, by any measure, enormous, a vast blue wilderness of open water punctuated by the occasional island, most of them tiny, all of them remote. The fact that human beings settled virtually every habitable island in this ocean, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south, from Easter Island in the east to the Mariana Islands in the west, is one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of our species. The people who accomplished this, the ancestors of the modern Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian peoples, were navigators of a skill and daring that still inspires awe. They sailed without compasses, without sextants, without GPS, reading the stars and the swells and the winds and the flight patterns of birds to find their way across thousands of kilometers of open ocean to islands they had never seen and could not have known were there. But before we reach the open Pacific, let us pause at the edge of it, because there is a civilization there that does not get nearly the attention it deserves, a civilization that was old when Egypt was young, and that left behind a record of extraordinary sophistication that was almost entirely destroyed in one of the great acts of cultural vandalism in recorded history. The civilization in question is not one you might expect. It is the culture of the Indus, which we have already touched. But here we mean to look at something adjacent, something that emerged in the same broad matrix of early human maritime culture along the coastlines of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. But to tell that story properly, we must first pause at a place that stands as a symbol of everything we do not know about the ancient Pacific. The island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, home of a place called Nan Madol. Nan Madol is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world, and it is also one of the least visited, which is a function of its extreme remoteness. It consists of a series of artificial islets, 92 of them, constructed in a shallow coastal lagoon off the southeastern shore of Pohnpei. The islets are built from massive basalt columns, some of them weighing up to 50 metric tons, stacked in a log cabin style to form platforms and retaining walls. On these artificial islands stand the ruins of a ceremonial and administrative centre that was the seat of the Sodelur dynasty, which ruled the island of Pohnpei for a period of roughly 1,000 years, beginning around 800 AD. The largest structure, Nanduas, has walls reaching 7 meters in height. The total volume of basalt used in the construction of Nan Madol is estimated at more than 1,800,000 metric tons. The basalt columns used in the construction came from quarries on the opposite side of the island of Pohnpei, or in some cases from even more distant sources. How they were transported across open water and positioned with such precision is a question the local oral tradition answers with stories of sorcery and levitation, which are not explanations available to the engineering-minded, but which reflect, perhaps, the genuine sense of impossibility felt by later generations contemplating the achievement of their ancestors. The site was occupied until roughly the 16th century, when the Sodelur dynasty was overthrown by a legendary warrior chief, and the city was abandoned. Within a few generations, it had become a place of supernatural fear, associated with the spirits of the dead, avoided by the living, left to the mangroves and the rising water. Today, Nan Madol is slowly sinking. The artificial islets are subsiding under their own weight, and rising sea levels are accelerating the process. Large sections of the site are already permanently flooded. Within a few centuries, barring intervention, it may join the list of civilizations lost beneath the ocean, this one not to the deep sea, but to the slow encroachment of the same warm shallows in which it was built. There is a poetic circularity to this, though perhaps not the most comforting kind. The Pacific is full of such stories, full of cultures that rose and achieved remarkable things, and then declined or transformed, or were overwhelmed by contact with European expansion, losing in a few generations the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The Rapa Nui people of Easter Island built their famous moai, the enormous stone heads that stand along the coastline facing inland, over a period roughly between 900 AD and 1500 AD. There are 960 of them in total, ranging in height from 2 meters to over 20 meters, the largest unfinished and still lying in the quarry where it was carved. For generations, the question of how the statues were moved from the quarry to their coastal platforms was answered by Rapa Nui oral tradition with the words, "they walked," a description that was long dismissed as charming mythology, and has more recently been demonstrated to be a perfectly accurate description of a technique by which the statues were levered from side to side in a walking motion by teams of people pulling ropes. The oral tradition was right. The scholars who dismissed it were wrong. This is a recurring theme in the study of forgotten civilizations. The Rongorongo script of Easter Island is one of the only pre-contact writing systems to have emerged independently in Oceania, and like the Indus script, it has resisted all attempts at decipherance. Only about 24 objects bearing Rongorongo script survive, most of them wooden tablets, and the script itself may not have been used to record language in the conventional sense, but rather as a mnemonic device, a visual aid for the recitation of texts already known to the reader. When European missionaries arrived on Easter Island in the 19th century, they appear to have been profoundly disturbing to the local culture in ways that extended well beyond the merely social. By the 1870s, following a series of catastrophic epidemics and slave raids that had reduced the island's population from several thousand to fewer than 111 people, there was no one left who could read Rongorongo. The tradition had been broken. The knowledge was gone. The tablets remained, mute and inscrutable, holding their secrets with perfect neutrality, offering nothing. This pattern of knowledge loss, the breaking of transmission chains by catastrophe, the reduction of complex cultural systems to silence by the destruction of the people who carried them, is one of the recurring tragedies of the story of forgotten civilizations. The Library of Alexandria is perhaps the most famous example, though its actual destruction was probably more gradual and complicated than the dramatic single burning that popular imagination prefers. But the destruction of Maya codices by the Spanish bishop Diego de Landa in 1562 is less well known and arguably more consequential in terms of what was actually lost. The Maya civilization, which we should visit in some depth, because it represents one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the pre-industrial world, developed in the lowlands and highlands of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Maya culture has a history of extraordinary length, from its earliest pre-classic manifestations around 2000 BC to the Spanish conquest and beyond, with many Maya communities maintaining their cultural traditions, their languages, and in some cases their calendrical practices to the present day. But the period of greatest classical achievement, the high period of Maya civilization, ran roughly from 200 AD to 900 AD, and during this period the Maya built cities of astonishing beauty and complexity, developed a writing system capable of expressing the full range of human thought with considerable precision, and created calendrical and astronomical systems of a sophistication that was not equaled in the Western world until the 17th century. The Maya calendar, or rather the several interlocking Maya calendrical systems, reflects an astronomical knowledge accumulated over centuries of careful observation. The Maya calculated the length of the solar year to a precision of roughly 33 seconds. They calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun, to within 2 hours over a period of 500 years. They tracked eclipses, the movements of Jupiter and Saturn, and possibly the precessional wobble of the Earth's axis over its 26,000-year cycle. All of this was accomplished through naked eye observation, careful record keeping, and a mathematical system that used positional notation and the concept of 0 centuries before either was developed in Europe. The Maya concept of time was not linear in the Western sense. It was cyclical, layered, recursive, a system of interlocking wheels in which past events were understood to echo and rhyme with future ones, in which the proper reading of the calendar could reveal both the appropriate ritual actions for any given moment and the broad shape of what was to come. This was not naivety or superstition, but a genuinely sophisticated philosophical position. That time has structure, that patterns recur, that the accumulated record of the past is the best guide available to the future. In this, the ancient Maya were anticipating ideas that would not find their way into Western intellectual culture until the development of complexity science in the late 20th century. Bishop Diego de Landa arrived in the Yucatan as a Franciscan missionary in 1549. He was, by the standards of his time and his institution, a zealous and in some respects effective religious administrator. He was also, by any standard, a destroyer. In July of 1562, at the town of Mani, he oversaw an auto da fe in which an enormous quantity of Maya cultural material was burned, approximately 5,000 Maya religious images, 13 altars, and, most catastrophically, an unknown number of Maya codices, the screenfold books in which generations of Maya scholars had recorded their astronomical observations, their histories, their ritual calendars, their medical knowledge, and the accumulated wisdom of their civilization. De Landa later wrote that he burned the books because they contained nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil. He also, in an irony that history could hardly have improved upon, wrote the most detailed account of Maya culture available from the early colonial period, preserving, in his effort to understand what he was destroying, fragments of the knowledge he was destroying. Of the many hundreds of Maya codices that must once have existed, exactly 4 survive. 4. They are named after the cities in which they are now preserved: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex. These 4 surviving books contain astronomical tables, ritual almanacs, and divinatory calendars of extraordinary sophistication. They give us a window onto Maya intellectual life that is both invaluable and heartbreaking. Invaluable because they demonstrate with absolute clarity what the Maya were capable of. Heartbreaking because they represent perhaps 1% of what once existed. The decipherment of the Maya script, which was accomplished over several decades beginning in the 1950s and largely completed by the 1990s, is one of the great intellectual detective stories of the modern era. For most of the 20th century, mainstream Maya scholarship believed that the script was primarily logographic, that it represented concepts rather than language, and therefore could not be phonetically decoded. This view is overturned by the work of a Russian linguist named Yuri Knorozov, who argued in the early 1950s that the script was at least partially phonetic and could in principle be read. Knorozov was working in Leningrad during the Cold War, and his work was initially dismissed in Western scholarship partly on political grounds, which is not a particularly proud moment in the history of academic objectivity. Eventually, through the work of scholars, including Tatiana Proskoryakov, who demonstrated in the early 1960s that the inscriptions on Maya monuments recorded actual historical events and named actual historical individuals, and through the collaborative epigraphic workshops organized by Linda Shealy, Peter Matthews, and Floyd Lounsbury in the 1970s and 80s, the script was cracked. What the Maya texts actually say is, in many ways, different from what earlier scholars had imagined. For most of the 20th century, the classical Maya were imagined as a peaceful, philosophically inclined civilization of astronomer priests, a kind of tropical Athens of the ancient world. This was always somewhat idealized, a projection of academic longings, rather than a reading of actual evidence. The deciphered texts reveal a civilization that was, in many ways, intensely, almost exhaustingly political, full of dynastic rivalries, military campaigns, ritual bloodletting, human sacrifice, and the kind of complex hierarchical court culture that would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with medieval Europe or Tang Dynasty China. The Maya were not less interesting for being revealed as human rather than idealized. They were, if anything, more interesting, more recognizable, more legible as people rather than as symbols. The collapse of classic Maya civilization in the southern lowlands between roughly 800 and 900 AD is one of the most studied and most argued over events in ancient history. Within the space of roughly 1 century, the great cities of the Petan, the lowland heartland of classic Maya civilization, were depopulated. Construction on the monuments stopped. The last dated inscriptions were carved. The plazas that had thronged with people for 600 years fell silent. The jungle, which had been held back by continuous human effort, began its patient reclamation. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, Most of the great classic cities had been abandoned for 600 years, their pyramids invisible beneath the canopy, their very existence unknown to the invaders. The causes of the Maya collapse are, as with all great civilizational collapses, probably multiple and interacting. Drought, documented by paleoclimate studies of lake sediments and cave stalagmites, appears to have played a significant role. A series of severe droughts between approximately 800 and 900 AD would have devastated the Maya agricultural system, which was already under stress from centuries of population growth and agricultural intensification. Political fragmentation, endless warfare between competing polities likely made an organized response to climate stress impossible. And the ideological system that had organized classic Maya civilization, the system of divine kingship in which the ruler mediated between the human and cosmic realms, appears to have lost its legitimacy as conditions worsened, as the rains failed despite the rituals, as the kings could no longer deliver the cosmic order they had promised. This last point is worth dwelling on because it illustrates something important about how civilizations work and how they fail. A civilization is not merely an economic system or a military organization. It is also, perhaps primarily, a set of shared beliefs about how the world is ordered and what human beings owe to each other and to the cosmos. When those beliefs lose their explanatory power, when the priests perform the rituals and the rains do not come, when the king claims divine mandate and the harvests fail anyway, the intellectual and social infrastructure of a civilization can collapse as rapidly as its physical infrastructure. What the people walk away from when they leave a city is not just the buildings, but the shared story that made those buildings meaningful. This is why the stories that survive, the fragments of text, and the oral traditions and the myths encoded in architectural alignments and astronomical calendars are so much more than historical curiosities. They are the residue of belief systems powerful enough to organize tens of thousands of lives across hundreds of years, powerful enough to move mountains of stone across open water, powerful enough to track the motion of Venus across the sky, with a precision that took Europe another 1,000 years to match, even in their broken, fragmentary, partially decoded state. They tell us something essential about the range of human possibility, about the different ways it is possible to organize a life and a community and a relationship with the cosmos. Let us move now from the Americas to a part of the world that is even more thoroughly mysterious, a civilization so ancient and so completely erased that its very existence was unknown to modern scholarship until the accidental discovery of a few carved stones in the middle of the 19th century. We are going to the Indus Valley's eastern neighbor, the culture of ancient Elam, but more specifically, we are going to a site that predates Elam, predates Sumer, predates every named civilization in the Middle Eastern record, the site of Jiroft in the Kerman province of Iran. Jiroft came to the attention of the outside world in the early years of this century, when massive floods exposed previously buried artifacts in the region, and local people began excavating and selling ancient objects to the antiquities market before archaeologists could properly document the site. The objects that emerged were extraordinary. Chlorite vessels and tablets decorated with elaborate mythological scenes, geometric patterns of great sophistication, and images of creatures that do not appear in any other known ancient Near Eastern iconography. Some of the objects bore signs that may be a script, though this too is undeciphered. The dates assigned to the site place its peak activity around 2500 BC, making it contemporary with early Sumerian civilization, though the cultural tradition it represents appears to be distinct and in some respects more ancient. The Iranian archaeologist Yusef Majid-Zadeh, who led the first systematic excavations of Jiroft, beginning in 2003, argued that the site represents the remains of the legendary Arata, a city mentioned repeatedly in ancient Sumerian texts as a distant, wealthy, sophisticated rival and trade partner. In the Sumerian literary tradition, Arata was a place of great cultural achievement, a city of lapis lazuli and silver, somewhere in the eastern mountains, engaged in a complex rivalry with the city of Uruk. Whether Jiroft is in fact Arata is contested, but the existence of a major Bronze Age culture in the Iranian plateau, one that traded extensively with Mesopotamia and may have contributed significantly to the development of early writing and mythology, is no longer in doubt. Jiroft simply adds to the increasingly complex and non-linear picture of how civilization developed in the ancient world, not as a single invention in one place that spread outward, but as a cluster of parallel and interacting developments across a broad region, each contributing to and drawing from the others. The Sumerian tradition itself, which is one of the oldest literate traditions we have access to, is full of references to earlier, greater civilizations that preceded it. The Sumerians spoke of a time before the flood, a period of antediluvian kings who ruled for impossibly long periods. One king for 28,800 years, another for 36,000 years, dynasties stretching back into a mythological past that the Sumerians themselves clearly distinguished from their own historical present. For a long time, these stories were treated as pure mythology, as ancient peoples' attempts to explain their own origins through grandiose narrative. But the discovery of clear evidence of catastrophic flooding in the archaeological record of Mesopotamian sites, flooding events that correspond broadly to the period of rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, has given scholars pause. Not enough pause to take the antediluvian king lists as literal history, but enough to consider the possibility that these traditions, like the Australian Aboriginal memory of sea level rise, preserve a distorted but genuine recollection of a world that was dramatically altered by geological events. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest substantial literary work in the human record, contains within it a flood narrative of obvious structural similarity to the biblical story of Noah. In the Gilgamesh version, the flood survivor is named Utnapishtim, and he is granted immortality by the gods as a reward for preserving life during the deluge. Gilgamesh, searching for the secret of immortality, travels to the end of the world to find Utnapishtim and hear his story. The story is clearly mythological, clearly shaped by narrative convention and religious purpose, but embedded within it, like a seed within a fruit, is a memory of catastrophic flooding powerful enough to have persisted in oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down in the 2nd millennium BC. The 2nd millennium BC is itself a period of remarkable civilizational drama, a period sometimes called the Late Bronze Age collapse, which may be the most dramatic civilizational catastrophe in recorded history. Between approximately 1200 and 1100 BC, within the space of a few generations, virtually every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East simultaneously collapsed or severely declined. The Mycenaean Greek civilization, with its palace economies and linear B script, disappeared. The Hittite Empire, which had contested the eastern Mediterranean with Egypt, abruptly ended. The major cities of Ugrit and other Levantine trading centers were destroyed and never rebuilt. Egypt survived but was severely weakened, never again to reach the heights of its new kingdom. Cyprus was disrupted. The trade networks that had connected these civilizations dissolved. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are as debated as those of any great civilizational failure, and the most recent scholarship tends toward a systems collapse model, in which multiple stressors, drought, internal political stress, disruption of trade networks, and the movements of large groups of displaced people, referred to in Egyptian texts as the Sea Peoples, combined in ways that exceeded the resilience of what had been, for several centuries, a remarkably sophisticated and interconnected international system. The Bronze Age collapse resulted in a dark age of roughly 3 centuries, a period from which almost no written records survive, during which population declined dramatically across the eastern Mediterranean, long-distance trade contracted, and many of the technological and cultural achievements of the preceding centuries were lost or severely diminished. This dark age ended with the gradual emergence of Iron Age cultures, the rise of the Phoenicians as the dominant maritime traders of the Mediterranean, the consolidation of the Assyrian Empire in the Levant, and eventually the flowering of classical Greek civilization. But the Greek classical period, which we tend to treat as a kind of origin point for Western civilization, was in fact a recovery, a rebuilding from the rubble of the Bronze Age, drawing on whatever had survived of the earlier sophisticated international culture, and reconstructing, often imperfectly and incompletely, the kind of complexity that had been taken for granted 300 years earlier. Homer's epics, composed in the early centuries of the Greek recovery, look back nostalgically at the Bronze Age world of Mycenaean Troy, a world that was already ancient and legendary by Homer's time, already wrapped in the amber of myth. As you drift now, your breathing very slow, and your body very heavy in the most comfortable way, let the weight of all these centuries settle over you like a second blanket. We have been through so much time tonight. We have moved from the Atlantic to the Sahara, from Turkey to Pakistan, from Mexico to Easter Island, from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, and everywhere we have found the same pattern. Human beings of extraordinary capacity, building remarkable things, developing sophisticated knowledge systems, organizing complex societies, and then, for reasons that combine the geological and the climatic, and the political and the spiritual, those civilizations changing, declining, transforming, or disappearing. And everywhere, woven through the collapse and the silence, the stubborn persistence of knowledge, the way information moves from the dying to the living, from the flooded coastline to the highland, from the burned codex to the remembered chant, from the abandoned city to the oral tradition that will carry a faint echo of it forward for 1,000 years. There is one more civilization we should visit before the night deepens entirely, one that is often overlooked in favor of its more famous neighbors, but that represents, in many ways, the purest example of a culture that simply disappeared, leaving behind fragments so enigmatic and so beautiful that they have been inspiring argument and wonder for more than 2,000 years. We should go to the island of Crete in the southern Aegean and visit the Minoans. The Minoan civilization flourished on Crete and the surrounding Aegean islands from roughly 3000 BC to roughly 1100 BC, making it one of the first advanced civilizations in Europe. At its height, between approximately 1700 and 1400 BC, Minoan Crete was a maritime power of enormous wealth and cultural sophistication. The Palace of Knossos, the largest of several palace complexes on the island, covered an area of approximately 22,000 square meters, had 5 stories, contained hundreds of rooms, and was equipped with running water, flushing toilets, and light wells of elegant ingenuity. Its walls were painted with frescoes of extraordinary vibrancy, blue dolphins leaping through azure water, young men and women vaulting over the backs of enormous bulls, elegant court ladies in flounced skirts and elaborate hairstyles, a prince walking through a field of lilies, mysterious processions of figures carrying offerings. The Minoan frescoes are among the most beautiful things produced by any ancient culture, characterized by a fluid, joyful energy that feels curiously modern, a love of the natural world, of animals and flowers and the sea, that speaks across the millennia with undiminished clarity. The people who painted them clearly delighted in life, in the play of light on water, in the grace of athletic bodies, in the colors of the natural world. There is very little military imagery in Minoan art. very few scenes of battle or conquest, very few of the triumphant warrior scenes that characterize the art of Egypt and Mesopotamia and later Greece. This has led some scholars to characterize Minoan civilization as a rare example of a genuinely peaceful Bronze Age culture, though others are skeptical, noting that the absence of military imagery in the surviving record does not necessarily indicate the absence of military activity. The Minoans had two writing systems. The first, known as Cretan hieroglyphic, was used in the early Palace period and is completely undeciphered. The second, known as Linear A, was used throughout the Palace period and is also completely undeciphered. A third script, Linear B, which appears to derive from Linear A, and which was used in the later Mycenaean influence period of Cretan history, was deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952, and was found to record an early form of Greek. This decipherment was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, but it simultaneously clarified and deepened the Minoan mystery. Because Linear B turned out to be Greek, and Minoan civilization predated the Greek-speaking Mycenaeans, the language recorded in Linear A must be something else entirely. Something that is not Greek and is not related to any other known language, a unique language unconnected to any language family known to modern linguistics. The Minoans were, in other words, speaking and writing in a language that died with them, that was adopted by no later culture, that was carried forward by no descendant tradition. Whatever they said to each other in their market squares and palace halls, whatever prayers they offered in their peak sanctuaries high in the Cretan mountains, whatever records they kept of their trading voyages across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean, is gone in a way that the words of the Maya and the Harappans are not quite gone, because at least those writing systems have been partially cracked or might yet be cracked. The language of the Minoans may never be recovered, because there is nothing to compare it to, no known language with which it shares a family resemblance. Minoan civilization went into decline following a catastrophic eruption of the Santorini volcano, probably around 1500 BC, one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Holocene period. The eruption destroyed the island of Thera and generated tsunamis that battered the Cretan coastline, ash falls that disrupted agriculture, and possibly a climatic disruption of several years' duration. The Minoan palaces show evidence of destruction and rebuilding during this period, and the civilization never fully recovered its former dynamism. By around 1400 BC, the palaces were occupied by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, who adapted the Minoan palace system and the Linear A script to their own purposes, producing Linear B and the palace economy records that Ventris eventually decoded. By around 1100 BC, following the Bronze Age collapse, even the Mycenaean system had given way, and Crete settled into a long, quiet, dark age from which it would eventually emerge as part of the broader archaic Greek world. The Minoans are remembered now primarily through the later Greek myth of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature who lived at the heart of a labyrinth beneath the palace of Knossos, and demanded a tribute of Athenian youth until the hero Theseus killed it, with the help of the Cretan princess Ariadne. The myth is almost certainly a garbled memory of Minoan culture. The bull was clearly sacred to the Minoans. Their bull-leaping frescoes are among their most distinctive images. The palace of Knossos, with its hundreds of rooms, was genuinely labyrinthine, and the relationship between Minoan Crete and the mainland cities it traded with, and perhaps dominated, was clearly complex and charged with tension. The myth transforms these historical realities into something archetypal, something that speaks about the confrontation between the heroic individual and the monstrous system, between the mainland and the island, between the new order and the old. This is what myths do. This is what all the stories we have visited tonight are doing. They are transforming historical reality, which is always partial and contingent and full of loose ends, into something that has the shape of meaning, that carries an emotional and moral resonance, that can be transmitted across generations and centuries without losing its essential charge. The Great Flood story, told in Sumer and recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and echoed in 100 traditions from the Americas to Southeast Asia, is not simply a record of events. It is a way of understanding what it means to be human in a world that can be suddenly and completely transformed, what it means to survive what your civilization did not, what you owe to those who came before you and those who will come after. You are carrying these stories forward now, simply by hearing them, simply by letting them pass through your mind and settle somewhere in the deep architecture of memory. You may not remember the specific names Göbekli Tepe, Nan Madol, Linear A, the round heads of the Tassili N'Ajjer, though some of them may linger. What you will carry, without necessarily knowing you are carrying it, is something harder to name. The felt sense of deep time, the intuition that the world you move through is layered with the lives of people you will never know, that the ground beneath any city is full of the foundations of earlier cities, that every tradition of knowledge was built on an earlier tradition that was built on an earlier one. Still, reaching back into a darkness that is not empty, but full of voices we have not yet learned to hear. The last secret of forgotten civilizations is perhaps not a secret about them at all. It is a secret about us. It is the realization that we are not the culmination of history, but a link in a chain of enormous length, that the things we know are a small selection from the things that have been known, that the cultures we call primitive were often measuring the precession of the equinoxes and writing poetry and debating philosophy, while the cultures that later conquered or displaced them were, by comparison, considerably less accomplished in those particular arts. It is the realization that collapse is not the exception, but the rule, that every civilization that has ever existed has eventually changed beyond recognition or disappeared, and that this is not a counsel of despair, but simply an accurate reading of the record, one that encourages a certain humility about the permanence of any particular arrangement of human affairs. It is also paradoxically a source of wonder, because the record of forgotten civilizations is above all a record of human resilience, of the capacity to build and rebuild, to remember and to transmit, to find meaning in a cosmos that does not offer it prepackaged, to scratch images on rock faces and stack enormous stones and paint dolphins on the walls of palace corridors and track the path of Venus across the night sky with a precision that takes the breath away. The people who did these things were us. They were our ancestors in the most literal sense, the people whose survival and whose choices and whose knowledge, however transmitted and transformed, eventually led to the particular arrangement of circumstances that produced you, lying here in the warmth of your bed as the night deepens around you. The green Sahara is now desert, but it bloomed once, and the people who herded their cattle along its ancient lake shores carried the memory of that green world eastward with them toward the Nile, and it became part of the foundation of something extraordinary. The people of Göbekli Tepe buried their temple and walked away from it around 10,000 years ago, and somewhere in the long chain of cultural transmission that leads forward from that act, the impulse to build sacred spaces and mark the earth with meaning is alive in every place of worship in the world today. The Maya astronomers who tracked Venus to within 2 hours over 5 centuries are the intellectual ancestors. In some sense, that is not entirely metaphorical, of the scientists who today track the orbit of satellites to within fractions of a second. The Minoan painters who caught the leap of a dolphin in pigment on plaster were doing what every artist does, reaching for the permanent in the fleeting, trying to hold something beautiful still long enough to share it. The stars are out now, probably, if you were to look out your window, though there is no need to look. You know they are there. The same stars the Maya watched, The same stars the builders of Göbekli Tepe used to fix the orientation of their temple pillars. The same stars the Polynesian navigators read to find their way across the Pacific. They have been watching over all of it. The rise and the fall, the building and the burning, the remembering and the forgetting, with the patient indifference of things that exist on a timescale so vast that even the longest-lived civilization is only a brief brightening. Let that vastness settle over you now, not as a weight, but as a kind of liberation. You are part of this, all of it. The 10,000 years of history we have moved through tonight, the dozens of cultures and languages and knowledge systems and artistic traditions, they're all woven into the fabric of the world you inhabit, even the ones that left no trace visible to the naked eye. The ground remembers. The water remembers. The stones, arranged in rings on hillsides around the world, remember. And somewhere in the deepest, oldest part of you, the part that existed long before your particular life began, you remember too. Sleep now. Let the images dissolve. Let the pyramids and the palaces and the painted caves grow soft and distant. Let the sounds of ancient languages fade into silence, that profound, meaning-saturated silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that has ever been said and is now simply resting, waiting for someone to listen again. The forgotten civilizations are not truly forgotten, while there are people willing to sit with the mystery of them, to hold the question of who they were and what they knew without demanding an answer, to feel the weight of their absence as something real and worthy of attention. You are holding that question now, and as you drift down through the last layers of wakefulness, through the borderland where thought becomes image and image becomes dream, carry with you one final thought from all this long night's wandering through the past. The most lasting thing any civilization leaves behind is not its buildings, not its writing, not its art, though all of these are precious. The most lasting thing is the shape of its questions, the questions the Maya asked about time, the questions the builders of Göbekli Tepe asked about the cosmos, the questions the Minoan painters asked about the relationship between the human body and the natural world. These questions did not die with the civilizations that first formulated them. They were inherited, transformed, asked again in different languages and different contexts, and they are still being asked tonight by people lying in beds all over the world, drifting towards sleep with the questions still alive in them, still luminous, still reaching. Sleep well. The past is very close tonight, and it is full of wonders.